A mirror turned to the wall, a glove burned in silence, and footsteps on the stairs that defy gravity. Somewhere between shadows and symmetry, a truth was buried, deliberately and with elegant cruelty. This is a story where every reversal conceals intention, and the gentlest gestures may mask the sharpest blows. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a damp and mist-laden evening in the early days of November that I found myself once more seated opposite my friend Sherlock Holmes. The fire casting flickers of orange against the walls of our Baker Street lodgings. Outside, the London fog pressed thick against the window panes, wrapping the gas lamps in halos of trembling light and muffling the rumble of hansom wheels along the cobbled street below. A certain quietude had fallen upon us that day, not of boredom, but of reflective silence. The kind Holmes seemed to relish as much as the thrill of pursuit. He sat curled in the armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, the pale light from the hearth outlining the sharp angles of his ascetic face. I, for my part, was buried in a copy of the Times, though truthfully my eyes wandered more than they read, lulled by the steady ticking of the mantel clock. It was in this subdued atmosphere, as if the city itself held its breath, that a hesitant knock rapped at the door below, timid, twice struck, and curiously distinct. Holmes's eyes opened at once, grey and alert. "We shall have company," he murmured, and not of the usual sort. Mrs. Hudson announced her with a brief, puzzled glance before vanishing into the hallway. The young woman who entered our sitting room did so with a grace so restrained, so careful in its measure, that one could almost mistake it for coldness until one looked closely at her hands. They trembled. She was dressed in a modest gown of mourning grey, the fabric worn but tastefully kept, a black ribbon knotted tightly at her throat. No veil obscured her features, which were pale and composed in the manner of one holding tightly to composure by force of will rather than natural temperament. Her eyes were of that washed slate-blue shade that reveals little at a distance, but hints at unrest beneath, and her gloved fingers clutched a small leather satchel with an intensity that suggested either grief or desperation, or both. Holmes rose courteously, but said nothing. I bade her to sit, which she did upon the edge of the chair nearest the fire, as if uncertain whether her presence in this room were entirely permissible. "My name is Eloise Hartley," she began softly, her voice controlled but pitched slightly too high for comfort. "I've come because I believe something dreadful has happened, something more than they say." Holmes inclined his head, but did not yet speak. I noticed he had shifted ever so slightly forward in his chair, a sign, long familiar to me, that he was already noting the woman's cadence, her silences, and the weight behind each syllable. "It is my cousin," she continued, "Leonard Hartley. We were raised as brother and sister nearly. I live in the same household, you see. The papers said it was an accident, that he fell down the main staircase and died instantly." She swallowed, eyes darting briefly to the hearth. I suppose it might be so." The coroner seemed satisfied. And yet, Holmes's voice, when it came, was low and unhurried. "You are not." She shook her head. "It is not one thing, Mr. Holmes, but a number of small ones. The servants say he was alone that evening, yet I heard footsteps, heavier than his. The banister was polished that day, yet there was wax near the top stair. And Leonard, he was always careful, almost to a fault. For him to have slipped—" She trailed off, glancing down at her satchel. "What troubles me most," she said after a pause, "is not the fall. It is what they found on him, or rather, how it was found." Miss Hartley opened the satchel with deliberate care, producing a small velvet pouch which she laid upon the table. From it she withdrew a man's signet ring, gold, modestly fashioned, bearing the Hartley crest of an ash tree and crossed keys. Yet even before she spoke, I observed something peculiar. It was on his right hand, she said, eyes now fixed on Holmes. But Leonard was left-handed. He never wore anything on his right. It irritated him, he said. Holmes did not take the ring, but leaned slightly to examine it from where he sat. Was it loose? Very, she replied. The mortuary attendant remarked upon it. It could have slipped off with the faintest tug. Then why, one wonders, Holmes murmured. Was it placed on that hand at all? Eloise hesitated. It wasn't his habit to wear it at all, not in recent months. He said it was an heirloom, but of no comfort to him. I found it strange that it should suddenly reappear, on the wrong hand and after his death. I glanced at Holmes, who had gone entirely still. A fire crackled softly behind the words, as if reluctant to break the quiet that followed. He said nothing, but his eyes darkened. I felt a surge of sympathy for the young woman, though her story, I confess, left me unconvinced. The mind, clouded by sorrow, often grasps at disjointed signs, weaving tragedy from happenstance. I ventured to speak gently. Miss Hartley, grief has a cruel way of conjuring doubt where none may truly exist. Might it not be that you seek patterns in what may be, in truth, a sad but natural accident? She turned to me with neither defensiveness nor offence. Perhaps, she said simply, Leonard was not a man to fall. I looked to Holmes, expecting a word of temperance, but found none. His gaze remained fixed upon the ring. He sat with the stillness I had come to associate with the earlier stirrings of his most tenacious pursuits. Only his fingers, pressed together beneath his chin, moved with the faintest tap-tap rhythm, a metronome to his inner calculations. "Tell me," he said at length, "was anything else taken or altered?" "No," Eloise replied. His watch, cufflinks, even a small banknote, untouched. Holmes nodded once, slowly, then folding his hands, he added, "Miss Hartley, I believe it would be advisable for you to leave the ring with us and, if you please, your gloves." She complied without hesitation, removing her gloves and laying them beside the pouch. Holmes inclined his head in thanks, and I noted the slight tremble that returned to her fingers as she drew her cloak about her shoulders. "Thank you, Miss Hartley," he said with gravity. "You have been most precise in your recollections. That is more useful than certainty." When the door closed behind her and her faint footfalls had faded down the stair, I turned to Holmes. "Well," I asked, "you appear more moved than I expected. Do you truly think there is cause for suspicion?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he reached for the gloves. Fine kid leather, pale grey, unlined at the wrist. He lifted the left one delicately, and before my eyes, he brought it to his nose, inhaling faintly. "Aha!" he murmured, so softly it was nearly lost to the fire's whisper. I blinked. "Surely you do not detect poison?" "No," he replied, folding the glove with precision. "But grief has no scent. This glove, however, carries one, and it does not belong to Miss Hartley." "What then?" Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Something too deliberate to be mourning, something that speaks of preparation, not loss." And with that, he fell silent once more. The following morning found us abroad by 8:30, a thin fog still clinging to the brick facades and iron railings of Kensington like an old, damp shawl. Holmes, ever indifferent to weather and more attuned to the terrain of motive and circumstance, strode beside me in silence, the only sign of his thought being the abruptness with which he would halt and check the number upon a doorplate. We reached our destination shortly before 9, a house of sober elegance on a street of genteel sameness, where modest fortune and hereditary discretion seemed to have made their quiet pact. A constable stood idly at the gate, having clearly found nothing to arrest but boredom, and admitted us without protest. As we passed through the wrought iron gate, I was struck by the dignified hush of the place. The curtains were drawn, the garden tended but unblooming, and no sound came from within save the measured ticking of some distant hall clock. Holmes paused before the door and glanced up at the high front windows. "It is in such quiet houses," he said softly, "that noise is most felt when it arrives." We were met at the threshold by a woman of severe countenance and middle years, who introduced herself as Mrs. Hewson, the housekeeper. With a manner both deferential and impassive, she led us to the central hall where the fateful staircase ascended with an understated grace to the floor above. The banister was of polished mahogany, the steps carpeted in a burgundy runner that dulled all sound. At the foot of the stairs, a modest arrangement of lilies had been placed atop a side table, more decorative than funereal, yet not without symbolic weight. "The master was found here," Mrs. Hewson said, gesturing without emotion. Face down, his neck quite turned. Her voice faltered, but only briefly. Holmes observed her with a gaze of studied neutrality. "And you were the one who discovered him?" "Yes, sir. At 9:30, when he did not ring for breakfast." Something in the crispness of her reply struck me as overly prepared, like a well-rehearsed line in a sombre play. Holmes knelt without ceremony and examined the lower steps with that curious intensity which never failed to draw the eye to things otherwise unseen. He ran his fingers lightly over the carpet's surface, then produced his lens from the inner pocket of his coat. "There has been more than grief here," he murmured. "Do you observe this, Watson?" I stepped closer, uncertain what I was meant to find, but as Holmes tilted the lens slightly, I discerned faint irregularities, scuff marks, dull patches in the pile where the nap had been disturbed. "These were not made by a body falling downward," Holmes said quietly. "No, the abrasion points upward." He moved 3 steps higher, confirming the pattern. A dragging motion, upward pressure on the carpet fibres. Not consistent with the physics of a backward fall. I furrowed my brow. Perhaps a servant ascending in haste afterwards. He looked up, expression unreadable. "Is a possibility, certainly, but one must ask why that servant's shoes would press so firmly while ascending, yet leave no marks in descent." Holmes's attention shifted to the banister. He touched it lightly with the back of his knuckle, then leaned closer and scraped something with his thumbnail, a pale, translucent smear against the varnished wood. "Candle wax," he said, holding it to the light. "But the house is fully fitted with gas," I replied. "Surely there would be no need for candles." "Precisely," he said, pocketing the scrap in an envelope. "Gaslight floods this stairwell. No servant would carry a taper here unless deliberately avoiding notice." Mrs. Hewson, still standing respectfully nearby, spoke then. "There was a brief interruption in the supply that evening, sir. Only a few minutes. We keep tapers on hand for such events." Holmes inclined his head without looking at her. "Naturally." He turned his eyes again to the top of the staircase, where the final steps disappeared into the gloom of the upper floor. His silence, now sharpened, seemed to draw down with it a curtain of disquiet. As Holmes resumed his quiet survey of the banister and mouldings, I found myself reflecting on the simplicity of the scene. A staircase, a fall, a death. The very banality of the architecture seemed to argue against conspiracy. I could not help but feel that Miss Hartley's suspicions, however sincere, had perhaps been coloured by affection and grief. "I confess," I said, "that I see no more than an unfortunate accident. Staircases are treacherous things, and in twilight more so." Holmes did not respond. He remained crouched beside the final step, eyes narrowed, fingertips pressed lightly to the wood as though seeking a pulse in the timber itself. "Surely," I continued, "you do not suspect foul play based on a patch of wax and a few scuffed threads?" Still he gave no reply, and I knew better than to press further. Silence in Holmes was often the sound of a mechanism catching hold. Mrs. Hewson had retrieved a small box from the study, a velvet-lined tray containing the personal effects of the late Mr. Hartley, returned from the mortuary. Among them was a gold signet ring, which Holmes lifted with the corner of his handkerchief and studied without commentary. "You will observe," he said at last, "that this is a family crest. Ashtree and Cross Keys. We saw its likeness on the stationery, did we not? I nodded. Yes, Hartley's. He turned the ring slightly. And yet it is sized for the right hand. Loose enough, in fact, that it would have come off in sleep. But Leonard Hartley was left-handed. Precisely. He placed the ring back in the tray and closed the lid with delicate precision. A detail, he said, so small it might escape the notice of grief, or be planted in its service. Once more, the room felt heavier than it had a moment before. We departed the house not long after, the fog outside having thinned to a pale gauze through which Kensington's facades loomed, softened and spectral. Holmes walked beside me in silence, his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze fixed somewhere ahead, as though measuring not pavement but implications. As we reached the street's end, he turned for one final glance at the house. The tall windows, the shuttered parlour, the narrow stair visible through the glass. Gravity does not lie, he murmured, but people do. I turned to him, but no further explanation was offered. His expression was one I had come to know well, remote, composed, yet etched with the faintest shadow of resolve. Whatever theory had begun to coalesce in his mind, he would not speak of it yet, not until the shape of it could stand on its own. So we walked on, the morning mist curling at our heels. We were admitted once more to the Hartley residence, this time not by the housekeeper, but by a young maid whose cautious manner betrayed her unease. She led us through the hushed corridors to a drawing room where the heavy curtains had been drawn against the grey morning light, casting the space in a dim amber hue, broken only by the flicker of a single gas jet. There, seated with statuesque composure, was Mrs. Celia Hartley, the widow. She rose as we entered, a gesture of greeting rather than welcome, and inclined her head with that precise economy which marks those trained in decorum rather than sentiment. Her garments were those of mourning, black bombazine trimmed with jet beading, yet there was a studied harmony to her appearance that suggested a stylist's hand rather than a widow's haste. She gestured for us to sit and resumed her position by the hearth, hands folded neatly, eyes level and expressionless. The silence that followed was not born of grief, but of calculated civility. "My husband's death," she began, her voice low and well modulated, "was a tragedy of the most senseless sort. I was in the morning room when I heard the fall. I rushed out and found him, already gone. They say it was his neck, the doctor's, I mean." Her fingers fluttered briefly, then composed themselves again in her lap. "I sent for the police, the doctor, the vicar. One acts, of course, without thought in such moments." Holmes had not spoken. I noted his gaze was fixed not upon her face, but upon her hands, gloved, motionless, and resting with careful precision upon the folds of her skirt. "I do not understand," she continued, with the faintest tremor in tone, "why Miss Hartley would bring an outside inquiry. There is no mystery, only sorrow." Still, Holmes said nothing. The ticking of the clock on the mantel filled the room like a metronome. He waited, as always, to see what she would not say. It was not until Mrs. Hartley turned slightly to adjust a flower arrangement on the nearby table that I noticed the richness of her morning attire more fully. The fabric, though black, shimmered faintly in the subdued light, and the intricate detailing at the sleeves bore the unmistakable hand of expensive tailoring. There was a faint scent of heliotrope about her, not unpleasant, but oddly deliberate in one whose husband had died less than a week prior. Even the cut of her veil, drawn up but resting lightly along her shoulders, had been edged with fine lace, as though designed not for concealment but for show. I do not say she did not grieve. That is a matter of soul, not dress. But there was something too orderly in her presentation, too polished, as though sorrow had been pressed and stitched into a costume rather than suffered in truth. Holmes remained as he was, unmoving, and I found myself oddly grateful for his silence. Holmes shifted at last, folding his hands loosely in his lap. His voice was gentle when it came, and deceptively casual. I understand Mr. Hartley had business dealings of some complexity. Had he made any recent alterations to his testamentary affairs? Celia's eyes flicked just once to the fireplace. He was quite orderly in those matters, nothing of note that I am aware of. You were his sole beneficiary. Her reply came after a pause that was almost imperceptible. Naturally, quite naturally, Holmes echoed, his tone neutral. She adjusted the hem of her skirt. If these questions are to determine whether I had cause to harm my husband, I will tell you now, Mr. Holmes, I had none. Leonard and I had our differences, as any couple, but I was devoted to his comfort. I should like to see this inquiry concluded swiftly. Holmes inclined his head, but did not withdraw. There was, in that moment, the faintest sense of tension beneath her calm. As she stood to summon tea, the movement caused her cuff to ride up, revealing a slender bracelet of black pearls clasped at her wrist. It caught the light, just briefly, but enough for Holmes's gaze to settle upon it. A lovely piece, he remarked. Rare to see mourning jewellery of such craftsmanship. May I? She hesitated. It was a gift from Leonard, some time ago. Before or after your marriage? He asked softly. She smiled thinly. I cannot recall. I had seen enough in Holmes's expression to know he had already formed an opinion. Black pearls of that quality were rare, and rarely gifted without occasion. They spoke not of affection, but of wealth and recent acquisition. I wondered then whether her mourning attire, so meticulously assembled, had been designed with this very drawing-room in mind. As if grief for her was a stage, and we its reluctant audience. But Holmes only nodded and said, How fortunate to possess so tasteful a memory. We made our parting courtesies shortly thereafter. Holmes offered a soft compliment on the orderliness of the household, to which Mrs. Hartley replied with gracious brevity. Yet I noted, as did Holmes I am certain, that her expression changed at that remark, a subtle tightening at the jaw, a flicker, quickly smothered, of something cold behind the eyes. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, but it was there. Outside the parlour, as the maid retrieved our coats, I looked back once more at the drawing-room. Nothing had moved, not a cushion out of place, not a curtain stirred. It was a tableau of grief, arranged with the symmetry of a wax museum. Holmes waited until the front door closed behind us before speaking, and even then, not at once. The fog had begun to gather again along the street, and the lamps had taken on their spectral glow. When he did speak, it was not to explain, but to observe. There is grief, he said at last, that is wild, and grief that is hollow. Hers is neither. What then? I asked. She wears it like a costume, fitted, lined, designed to deceive. I frowned. You believe she had a hand in her husband's death? I believe, he said, that we have not yet seen her hands as they truly are. With that, he hailed a cab, and we climbed aboard in silence. I did not yet know what troubled me more, that Holmes suspected her, or that I, in spite of myself, had begun to suspect her too. It was early the next morning when Miss Eloise Hartley returned to Baker Street, her countenance paler than before, and her expression tinged with a strange mixture of dread and determination. She removed her gloves with trembling fingers and drew from her reticule a folded sheet of yellowing stationery, sealed in an envelope worn soft at the corners. I found it late last night, she said quietly. It was in Leonard's desk, inside a false panel. I had never noticed it before. Holmes took the missive with great care, holding it up to the morning light and turning it in his hands, as though it might emit sound if pressed just so. You have not read it? She shook her head. I dared not. Then let us remove the mystery, Holmes said, breaking the seal with a letter opener, and unfolding the sheet with deliberate slowness. Watson and I leaned forward, drawn less by curiosity than by the unmistakable chill that had entered the room along with the letter. It was the sort of quiet that precedes thunder, not in the sky, but in the lives of men. Holmes began to read, his voice steady, but his eyes grew darker with each line. My dear Eloise, If this letter reaches you, then I fear my instincts have come too late to protect me. I cannot say with certainty what is amiss, only that something, someone, has shifted around me in subtle but undeniable ways. Faces wear too perfect expressions. Words arrive too swiftly, as though rehearsed. I feel watched even within my own home. The clocks tick, but they are not keeping my time. I do not trust the silence. I have spoken to no one of this. Not yet. There is something I must confirm first. But if I do not return, or if I am found in a way that suggests folly or chance, you must believe neither. The truth is not where it should be. The hand is wrong. L. The letter ended thus, unsigned beyond that single initial, and offering neither accusation nor explanation. Holmes folded it once more and placed it beside him on the table. His expression was unreadable. Eloise sat motionless, her fingers clenched in her lap. I glanced between them, unsettled by the letter's tone, which bore none of the melodrama of fiction, and all the quiet despair of a man certain of doom, but unsure of its author. "The hand is wrong," I repeated softly, turning the phrase over. It could refer to handwriting, perhaps, a forged note, or an altered document. Holmes did not answer at once. He stood, pacing slowly, his fingertips pressed together as though to trap the thought between them. "Or," I continued, "perhaps a reference to Leonard's dominant hand. Was he right-handed?" "He was left-handed," Eloise said quietly. "Always." "Then the phrase may simply mean something felt out of place. Or, pardon me, perhaps it is the letter of a man lapsing into paranoia." Holmes stopped before the fire, one hand resting on the mantel. "No," he said at last. "This is not the language of madness. It is the language of fear, deliberate, sharpened by restraint. The hand is wrong may well mean more than misplacement. It may mean disguise." And with that, he rang for the housekeeper. There were questions to be asked where footsteps had fallen, both heard and concealed. Holmes returned to the letter once the door had closed behind the departing maid. He drew it toward him once more, studying not its contents, but its construction. "The paper," he murmured, "is from Hartley's own supply, watermarked, thick. No forgery here." He held it at an angle to the gaslight. "Note the flow of ink, uneven. The pen faltered, not from poor equipment, but haste." He turned the page over. "And see here, this fold, crisper than the rest. It was closed hastily, with the ink barely dry, yet the outer crease has worn more than the inner, meaning it was hidden immediately, not consulted again." I watched him with fascination. He meant it for discovery. Indeed, but only after his death. There was no intent to deliver, only to warn. Holmes folded it again, more gently than before, and placed it in his breast pocket. "There are truths men cannot say aloud," he remarked. "They must whisper them through paper, or silence." We returned that same afternoon to the Hartley residence, but on this occasion, Holmes requested that his inquiries be kept discreet. The late Mr. Hartley's household staff were summoned one by one to the drawing room, where the fire had been lit and the chairs arranged with a strange, unintended formality. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hewson, was the first to enter. Her manner was as composed as before, though I noted a slight tightening about the lips as Holmes addressed her with gentle inquiries. "Were you present in the house on the night of Mr. Hartley's death?" "I was, sir, in my quarters." "Did you hear anything unusual?" "A fall, certainly, and a noise before it. A cry, perhaps, though muffled." She said it with the air of one who had rehearsed the memory into submission. The gardener followed, offering nothing more than remarks on the lateness of the frost and the state of the gravel path. Holmes dismissed him with a nod. One by one they came, polite, hesitant, vaguely afraid. Holmes, always gracious, recorded nothing. Yet I could see the ledger writing itself behind his gaze. It was not until the last, the parlour-maid, that the surface began to crack. Mary, a thin girl with restless eyes, twisted her apron as she entered. Holmes, sensing her nerves, invited her to sit, which she did with a grateful sigh. Pardon me, sir. I'm not sure if it's of any importance, she began. Let us decide that, Miss Mary. She swallowed. It was late. I had gone to fetch the tea set from the morning room. The lights had gone out, just briefly, and I was coming up the back stairs when I saw someone descending the front. Who? I thought it was the mistress, or perhaps it wasn't. The light was dim, but... Yes. She was wearing gloves, black ones, elbow length. But the house was warm, sir, and she never wears gloves indoors. Never. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You are quite sure? Mary nodded, her eyes darting to the closed door. It seemed odd, that's all. Holmes did not press further. He thanked her, and she left the room with visible relief. When the door had closed behind her, Holmes remained still for several moments, his eyes fixed upon the dying embers in the hearth. The room had grown quiet again, but not peacefully so. The hand is wrong, he repeated at last. He did not mean handwriting, nor metaphor. He meant it precisely. I waited, but no fuller explanation came. The ring on the wrong hand, he continued, almost to himself. The gloves on the stairs. A woman descending in shadow. A man who never slipped, but was made to fall. And a letter placed just out of time. I opened my mouth to speak, but he lifted a finger slightly. Not yet, Watson. We are gathering kindling. The fire will follow soon enough. He rose, coat already in hand. There is one more piece that must fall into place. Then we shall know which hand moved it, and why. Holmes lingered behind after the final interviews, feigning interest in a mantelpiece engraving until the last servant had returned to her duties. I knew well the rhythm of his silences. They were rarely idle. When the moment ripened, he stepped lightly into the servants' corridor and called, in a voice more gentle than commanding, Miss Mary. The parlour-maid turned, startled. Her fingers clutched a folded cloth, though it was clear she had long since finished any chore involving it. Her glance shifted quickly, from Holmes to me, then down the hall, as though expecting interruption. We are not here to alarm, Holmes said, in that unhurried tone he used only when words served as tools rather than traps. Only to understand. Mary nodded, barely. She seemed about to retreat, then faltered and remained still. Her face bore the strained composure of a child hiding a secret too long. I think, Holmes said, lowering his voice slightly, you have seen something. You are unsure whether it matters. Let me assure you, it does. Mary's eyes flicked up once, then stayed, and slowly, as though releasing something heavy, she began to speak. I had just come up from the scullery, sir, she whispered, her voice thin and hoarse with remembered fear. It was near 10. The lights had gone out for a spell, just a few minutes. I thought nothing of it. I came by the back hall and saw someone descending the main staircase. She paused, eyes darting again toward the parlour doors. Holmes nodded slightly, urging her to continue. I thought it was the mistress, Mrs. Hartley. She moves lightly, always. But something was strange. She was wearing gloves, black, long ones. I could see them clearly, even in the gaslight's flicker. Holmes's brow furrowed. Was it cold? No, sir. The house was warm. The fire was blazing in the drawing room. Mrs. Hartley never wears gloves indoors. Not unless... She stopped herself. Not unless what? Mary's voice dropped further. Not unless she wishes not to be recognized. There was a silence between us, thick and fragile. Then Holmes nodded once. Thank you, Miss Mary. You have given us more than you know. We followed her silence down the corridor, though Holmes's mind, I knew, was already ascending those stairs anew. Holmes returned to the base of the staircase with unhurried purpose, his eyes flicking over the woodwork with almost predatory stillness. Producing a taper from his pocket, he struck a match and held the flame close to the banister rail. The flickering light revealed nothing at first glance, until he gently ran a folded white cloth along its length. A faint smear appeared, pale, translucent, no more than a whisper of wax and dust clinging in uneven stripes. "Here," he murmured, half to himself. "At the upper curve, just so." I looked closely. It was not a place one would naturally grip unless one intended to remain hidden while descending, perhaps in darkness. "But if the gas was briefly out," I said, "surely the wax is explained." Holmes shook his head. No candle was needed to descend. It was used to avoid something brighter. Gaslight reveals identity. Candlelight conceals it. He folded the cloth and extinguished the taper, the flame dying with a hiss. What remained was less than smoke, yet far more. Holmes made his way to the drawing room and knelt before the fireplace with a peculiar intentness. The coals were long cold now, but the surrounding bricks still retained the ghost of warmth, and the air carried a lingering perfume of dried wood and iron. He sifted the ashes gently with a small spoon from the mantel, examining the dust with a narrowed eye. His movements were careful, methodical, almost reverent. "No trace of wool," he said, more to himself than to me. "No soot press, no disturbance of fibre, nothing cast in." He rose and brushed the hearth clean with 2 strokes of his gloved hand. "She wore gloves by that fire," he said, glancing toward the seat where Mrs. Hartley had posed her grief with such studied grace. "Yet none were dried here, none removed, none present." "Then where did they go?" I asked. Holmes's gaze turned toward the rear of the house. "Some warmth," he said dryly, "does not belong in drawing rooms. It hides behind stoves and servants' grates, where its ashes speak more freely." And he was already striding toward the kitchen. The cook, though flustered by Holmes's sudden entrance, offered no resistance when he requested leave to inspect the stove behind the scullery range. The chamber was still warm, though the morning's meal had long since been cleared. Holmes crouched low, lifting the iron ash drawer with both hands and setting it aside. He peered into the narrow cavity behind the stoveplate, reaching into the shadows with a pair of long-handled tongs produced, inexplicably, from within his coat. There was a pause, then a faint metallic clink, and he drew out something blackened, curled at the edges, and faintly glistening with the remnants of silk. A glove, or rather, what had once been one. The surface was half consumed, the fingers warped and shrunken, yet the outline was unmistakable. A woman's evening glove, elbow length, trimmed in lace. Holmes laid it gently upon the tiled floor and regarded it without expression. "No soot upon the drawing-room hearth," he murmured. "Yet this one was cast to burn," and hurriedly, at that, he folded it once, carefully. Because it mattered, because it was meant to disappear. He did not say it aloud, but I understood then that it had failed in its vanishing. Holmes examined the ruined glove once more, drawing a small piece of chalk from his pocket and marking its interior seam with a precise cross. "The left," he said simply. I watched him for a moment before speaking. Leonard Hartley was left-handed. The ring he wore was placed on his right. Holmes gave a faint nod, as if I had just reached the lowest step on a staircase he'd already ascended. "One left-hand glove destroyed, the other unaccounted for," I said. "No," Holmes corrected gently. "The other was never meant to exist, or rather, only one was required for the performance." He slipped the scorched glove into an oilskin pouch and returned it to his coat, as solemnly as a curate pocketing a communion relic. I followed him back into the corridor, where the light struck the floor in dusty columns. The weight of unspoken meanings hung there as palpably as the scent of coal. It was a silence filled not with absence, but with a single deliberate omission. We stepped once more into the passage from which Mary had first spoken, the corridor dim and smelling faintly of soap and brass polish. Holmes halted beside the door to the pantry and stood very still, his voice soft and low, more musing than declarative. Disguise, my dear Watson, he said, is not mere concealment. It is speech, carefully composed, intended to be read and misread at once. He gestured faintly with his gloved hand. One glove burned, one glove worn, not to hide identity, but to shape its appearance. A woman seen in gloves where gloves should not be worn. A hand left bare when it should have revealed allegiance. A ring on the wrong hand. All inversions. Deliberate. Rehearsed. I felt a chill creep into the lining of my coat. But why mislead so subtly? Because the audience, Holmes replied, was not the constable, nor the household. It was the eye of one soul, one who might remember which hand a man used to sign his name, or which wrist bore his watch. And who was that? Holmes turned his gaze toward the drawing room. The one who would mourn. He said no more. And yet the echo of his thought filled every room we left behind. We returned to the Hartley residence at Holmes' quiet request, and this time were shown into the late Mr. Hartley's study, a narrow wood-panelled chamber whose sombreness was not merely due to the drawn blinds. The room bore that unnerving combination of meticulous arrangement and unspoken absence. Papers squared too neatly, an inkwell without a speck, a globe halted mid-rotation as if interrupted mid-thought. Holmes moved through the space with his customary silence, fingers trailing over the back of a green leather armchair, pausing now and then before framed sketches and brass bookplates. I found myself unsettled, not by any overt sign of disturbance, but by the suffocating quiet of a life tidied too quickly after its cessation. On the desk, a single book lay closed. Holmes opened it, revealing no inscription, only pressed pages, brittle and dry. He was not reading, he murmured. He was arranging. He glanced at the coal scuttle, untouched since our last visit, and then at the wastepaper basket, empty except for a torn envelope, addressed but never sealed. There is nothing chaotic here, Watson, Holmes said, and yet there has been violence. The contrast troubles me. It was while standing at the far end of the study, near the bookcase, that Holmes's attention fastened upon a portrait hung just above the writing bureau. It was an oil rendering, of moderate skill, depicting a man in hunting attire, one boot resting atop a fallen log, a hound at his side. The features were vaguely familiar, an uncle, perhaps, or Leonard's father. Yet it was not the face that drew Holmes's prolonged gaze. "Observe the hands," he said quietly. I stepped closer. At first, nothing struck me. The figure held a riding crop in his left, his right hand braced casually on his hip. And yet, Holmes continued, the crop's buckle is affixed, as though to be worn in the right. And the signet there. See it? On the third finger of the right hand, when it should, traditionally, reside on the left. The painter had either made a curious error or recorded something quite deliberate. An inversion, Holmes murmured, as though seen through a looking glass. He looked away from the canvas then, and I sensed that it had confirmed something he had long suspected, but not yet voiced. Holmes seated himself at the desk and folded his hands before him, eyes still fixed upon the portrait, though his thoughts had clearly passed beyond its frame. "There are moments," he began, "when the truth is not concealed by darkness, but by symmetry. A reflection can appear faithful while reversing what matters most." I said nothing, unsure if he spoke of the portrait, the room, or the case entire. "The ring on Hartley's right hand," Holmes continued, "a detail minor enough to escape scrutiny, and yet jarring to those who knew him. And now a painting which echoes that same misplacement." He turned toward me. "One must ask, what is the purpose of such a reversal? Not to hide the ring, its presence was visible, but to confuse orientation, to mislead the eye, not obscure it." "Inversion as camouflage," I offered. He nodded. "Precisely." Holmes stood. "A person known to be left-handed might wear a glove on the right for the same reason. not to disappear, but to redirect suspicion, and in doing so, to suggest an accident where there was none. There was in his voice a chill I had not heard since Stoke Moran. Holmes now turned his attention to the room itself, this time not as a scene of habit, but as a theatre of time. He walked slowly from lamp to window, pausing by the fireplace where the clock upon the mantel ticked with deliberate rhythm. "Observe the lamp on the writing desk," he said. "The wick trimmed, the reservoir full. Unused that evening." He moved to the sideboard. "And here, the tea tray. One cup poured cold now, the pot half full." I bent to inspect the carriage clock beside the hearth. It stopped. Indeed. And note the hands. Set at 7:40. A precise time, not indicative of a winding failure, but an intentional halt. "You think it was altered?" "I think it was silenced," Holmes said. He walked to the window and parted the curtain an inch. The garden outside lay quiet, the hedges brown with frost. "From this room," he added, "one could have seen who entered by the garden gate, and when." There was a pause. "What we have, Watson, is not the absence of order. We have the manipulation of it, and it is far more dangerous." Holmes requested that we take a detour on our return journey through the adjacent lane, where a tidy cottage stood at the boundary of the Hartley estate. He knocked lightly at the gate, and after a moment, we were greeted by a thin, sharp-featured woman in her late 50s, who introduced herself as Mrs. Larch. "I believe you may have seen something the evening Mr. Hartley died," Holmes said, with that disarming courtesy which so often prompted revelations before the speaker knew they had begun. She peered at us with a mixture of suspicion and pride. "I did see someone," she admitted. "Two, in fact, arguing, just past dusk." "Where?" "Near the bench beneath the yew arch. Mr. Hartley and his wife, though she wore a hat I did not recognise, black with netting." She raised her voice, which was uncommon for her. He turned away, and she caught his arm. Holmes said nothing but scribbled this down. "Did she return through the house?" Mrs. Larch frowned. "I assumed so. I saw only her silhouette, but now that you ask, it didn't move like her. Taller, somehow. The same dress, perhaps, but the walk was not hers." Holmes closed his notebook softly and thanked her. Once more within the carriage, Holmes sat with hands laced and eyes narrowed. The evening fog pressed against the glass like a second skin, and for a time, neither of us spoke. "You noted the hat, Watson? The one described by Mrs. Larch?" "Yes. Celia Hartley wore no such headpiece when we called. Her mourning veil was pinned differently, gathered behind the ear, not across the face." "You think the woman in the garden was not her?" "I think it may have been," Holmes replied, "or someone meant to suggest her likeness. Either possibility is instructive. And if she was in the garden, then her statement that she remained inside all evening becomes less a misstatement," he interrupted, "than a conscious edit, a lie dressed in mourning." Outside, the lamps had begun to flicker on along the embankment. Holmes did not look at them. "Every alibi," he said, "is a window, but some have curtains pulled just far enough to show a sliver and conceal the rest." By the time we reached Baker Street, the fog had thickened into a soft, grey curtain through which the city moved in slow silhouettes. Holmes alighted first and stood for a moment at the curb, unmoving. "There is something uncanny," he said at last, "in a figure glimpsed by lamplight, made familiar only by silhouette and costume. Such figures haunt the mind more than any ghost, because they were meant to be seen and misinterpreted." "A decoy?" I asked. He turned to me. "Or a mask?" I followed his gaze as it drifted over the distant gaslight beyond the rooftops. "It is possible," he said slowly, "that the woman in the garden was not Celia, and equally possible that she was, but had made herself into someone else. That," he added, "is the more clever deception." "And what purpose would that serve?" "To be seen," he replied, "at precisely the right moment, by precisely the wrong witness. He mounted the stairs without another word, and I knew the case, like the fog, had only begun to settle around us. It was under a thin drizzle, and a sky the colour of tarnished pewter that Holmes and I made our way to Queen's Road, Bayswater. The wind carried with it the bitter tang of coal smoke, and the shop fronts, lined in a dull succession of brick and soot, gave the street a look of bureaucratic resignation. Holmes, consulting the number scrawled in a notebook, stopped before a modest doorway whose paint had begun to blister around the frame. A weather-warped sign above the entrance read, "Temple and Bracknell, Solicitors and Commissioners of Oaths." Inside, the air was close and stale, with a faint smell of yellowing paper and varnish. A clerk, pale and ink-smudged, admitted us to a cramped office panelled in dark oak. There, seated behind a tidy desk, was a gentleman of narrow shoulders and careful grooming. His whiskers clipped too short to seem accidental, his expression one of cultivated neutrality. "Mr. Temple, I presume?" Holmes asked. The man inclined his head. The room was heavy with that peculiar stillness only found in legal offices, where silence is not peace, but precedent. Temple's voice was dry, his manner unfailingly correct. At first, he professed no recollection of Leonard Hartley beyond a single consultation, routine, unremarkable, and expressed polite regret at his client's death, the way one might at the passing of a distant acquaintance. Holmes listened without interruption. Then, with deliberate care, he withdrew a folded scrap of stationery from his coat and slid it across the desk. On it was Leonard's handwriting, compact, slanted, unmistakable. Temple's eyes moved across the page, and his mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "This was written on your letterhead," Holmes said, "and you will note the watermark matches the folio on your desk." Temple hesitated. Yes, of course. I did see Mr. Hartley twice. The second time was rather more involved, though still not formalised. I had not thought it relevant. "Let us be the judge of that," Holmes said evenly. There was a silence, during which the solicitor tapped a single finger upon the armrest of his chair. Then, with a sigh that was part calculation, part resignation, he opened the top drawer of his desk and withdrew a thin sheaf of notes. "The first time Mr. Hartley came," Temple began, now seated straighter. His inquiries were tentative. He wished to understand the mechanics of annulment, quiet annulment. He was anxious not to provoke scandal, particularly in regard to his household and extended family. "He cited betrayal?" Holmes asked. "Yes, though he would not elaborate. He stressed it was not a matter of infidelity. In fact, he insisted that the bond between him and Mrs. Hartley had not been physical in many months." Temple leaned back slightly, his fingers now loosely steepled. He spoke of change, of something not quantifiable. I found him lucid, articulate, but unmistakably uneasy. "Did he name any parties of concern? Servants? Acquaintances?" "No, he was deliberately vague. He seemed more troubled by the intangible, what he termed a shifting presence in his home. He used that exact phrase. And the second meeting, he returned with greater resolve. He had made certain private arrangements and wished to alter his will accordingly. I drafted a preliminary amendment, but it was never signed." "Why not?" "He said he was not yet ready to act, that there remained one matter to observe, a behaviour, a confirmation." Temple's voice grew quiet. He intended to wait just one more day. "He said something then," Temple continued, voice lower now, as if the walls themselves might absorb it. "It was near the close of our meeting. He stood to leave, then paused by the door. Holmes sat forward slightly, eyes fixed. 'She is not who she was,' Temple recited. That's what he said. Not in the sense of mood or disposition, not even of deception, but in some way I cannot articulate. She is other." There was silence in the room. "He looked afraid," Temple added. "Not of her, precisely, but of what she had become, as though some essential tether had slipped and what remained resembled her only in outline. I confess, the remark chilled me more than any overt accusation might have. Holmes, however, remained composed, though I noted a tightening about his jaw. "That is not the utterance of a jealous husband," I said. "No," Holmes agreed. "It is the remark of a man who has glimpsed an inconsistency in the fabric of his own life, and cannot unsee it." He stood and moved toward the window, where the rain had begun to draw diagonal lines upon the glass. "And when men see shadows where faces should be," he added, "they seldom sleep well." From a locked drawer in the corner of his desk, Temple now retrieved a smaller item, a sealed envelope, discoloured at the corners from handling. He wrote this during our second meeting. He did not wish to post it, nor deliver it. He said it was something he needed to write down to make it real, but not yet to send. Holmes held the envelope lightly, examining the seal. "May we?" Temple nodded solemnly. "It is addressed to no one. Only his initials mark the back. As far as I can determine, it was a private memorandum, or confession." Holmes broke the seal with a silver letter opener and unfolded the contents. His eyes moved across the page in swift, silent succession. He did not speak for some time. When he did, it was in a voice that carried not excitement but a curious weight. "I believe, Mr. Temple," he said, "that this document is not a confession, but a testament, and one not intended for a court, but for conscience." Holmes laid the letter on the desk, and together we read it, each line colder than the last, though not for lack of fire. There are figures in my ledgers I did not place, funds moved without trace, yet leaving behind the scent of design. She says nothing, but her silence is shaped, deliberate, clean. I have watched her hands touch what she denies seeing. I have seen her smile at questions not yet spoken. There are moments at night when I pass her door and smell lavender, always lavender, though the bottle remains full and unopened in her cabinet. She rises earlier now and burns the fireplace hotter. I do not know what she burns. I am writing this so that if I fall, and it is said to be accident, someone may recall that mirrors crack not by mischance, but by pressure. The mask slips in candlelight. It ended there. The phrase, "the mask slips in candlelight," struck me as particularly unsettling. Not metaphor, but a specific memory. Holmes refolded the paper with care. "He wrote this to himself," he said softly, "because even to suspect her aloud was to risk her hearing it first." We stepped out once more into the misted street, where the lamps flickered against the sodden air and the passers-by blurred into half-shapes beneath umbrellas. Holmes walked without haste, his gloved hands in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed upon something not in Bayswater but far beyond. He intended to escape, he said at last, not from the law, but from the illusion that his life was whole. And he failed. "No," Holmes replied after a pause. "He delayed, and in delay came death." He glanced sideways at me. "But even in dying he tried to leave a trail, one no court would admit, but which reason might still follow." And as the fog swallowed the street behind us, I could not shake the sense that we followed not a murderer, but a mask, exquisitely fitted, and slipping by degrees. The late afternoon brought with it a chill more psychological than meteorological, as we reassembled in the drawing room of the Hartley residence. Holmes had, with polite firmness, requested the presence of Mrs. Celia Hartley, her cousin Eloise, the family's solicitor Mr. Temple, and Inspector Hargreaves of the local constabulary. A fire crackled behind its iron grate, but it lent no comfort to the assembled company. Holmes stood with the quiet gravity of a man who has long glimpsed the truth but waits for the moment in which it must be uttered aloud. Celia sat with impeccable posture, her gloved hands folded on her lap, her expression one of studied calm. Eloise appeared visibly unsettled, while Temple, though outwardly composed, clutched his gloves with unnecessary force. The inspector, a lean man with a hawkish demeanour, leaned against the mantel, observing Holmes with measured expectancy. "I believe," Holmes began, "that enough shadows have passed through this house. If you will indulge me a few minutes' patience, I shall endeavour to remove them, one by one." No one spoke. Even the fire ceased its crackling, as though unwilling to interrupt what was to follow. Holmes paced slowly before the hearth, his voice low but distinct. "Let us begin, then, not with suppositions, but with the evidence of the physical world. The stairs upon which Mr. Hartley fell tell us something no sentiment or testimony can. The direction of movement." He turned to the inspector. "You recall the scuffing on the sixth riser. It marked an upward motion, not downward. Had Mr. Hartley fallen from above, that tread would bear no disturbance." Inspector Hargreaves gave a faint nod, his eyes narrowing. "Furthermore," Holmes continued, "the tea tray, placed atop the rosewood table in the corridor, bore 2 untouched cups and remained precisely where it was. Yet the maid swore she heard Mr. Hartley ask for tea just minutes before the fatal fall." Holmes gestured toward the window, and the wax, spilled beside the foot of the staircase, was soft, not hardened, meaning the candle had been extinguished but a moment before we arrived. I glanced at Celia. Her gaze was affixed to the fireplace, but the fingers in her lap had tightened. "These are not signs of accident," Holmes said. "They are the grammar of arrangement." Holmes now took from his coat a folded handkerchief, within which lay an object of pale significance, a single wax-dappled glove. "This," he said, "was found in the hearth below stairs. It is the left glove of a matched pair, the right of which we shall presently consider." He turned to Mrs. Hartley. "You stated to Inspector Hargreaves that you had worn only your right glove that evening to manage your lantern in the garden. You claim to have left the other inside, unused, and yet the presence of this burned fragment suggests otherwise." Holmes stepped lightly to the doorway. "Consider the angle of vision from the corridor. The maid reported seeing Mr. Hartley speaking to a woman in the stairs' half-shadow. What she noted was a candle held high and a dark-clad figure facing away. The flame obscured the face, but not the silhouette." He paused. "Now imagine the effect of reversed gloves. A right-handed woman appearing to hold a candle in her left, her free hand gesturing as though right-handed. It is a small deception, but effective when paired with the dimness of shadow and the sway of curtain." Holmes's voice turned quiet. The illusion was staged and, like all theatre, required rehearsal. Holmes now approached the small escritoire upon which Leonard Hartley's signet ring had been displayed after his death, retrieved from the surgeon's report and noted, with some confusion, to have been upon the right hand rather than the left. "This detail," Holmes said, lifting the ring between thumb and forefinger, "was dismissed by many as incidental. And yet, it is neither accidental nor trivial." He turned it slowly. "Mr. Hartley, like most gentlemen, wore his signet upon the 4th finger of his left hand, a matter of routine and familial tradition. To find it upon the right index finger at the time of death is not merely unorthodox, it is significant." He let the ring rest upon the polished wood. In shifting it, the perpetrator invited a subtle, almost invisible suggestion that the blow was struck by a right-handed assailant. The transfer alters our instinctive mental image of the act. He looked not at Celia, but at the fire. A murderer who understands the human tendency towards symmetry will often succeed in misleading both eye and inference. Then, glancing sideways, he added, "But signs meant to deceive often reveal far more than those made in honesty." Holmes folded his arms behind his back. Motive, though frequently buried beneath pleasantry, has its own signature. Mr. Hartley had, as Mr. Temple can attest, initiated proceedings to annul his marriage, an act he feared would bring public scandal, but one he deemed necessary. Mr. Temple, looking deeply uneasy, nodded. Had that annulment been completed, Holmes continued, Mrs. Hartley would have found herself dispossessed, not merely of name, but of inheritance, standing, and the privileges attached to them. The estate was entailed, his revised will unsigned. Her position, once secure, stood poised to vanish. Celia's breath, though imperceptible to most, hitched. She neither spoke nor shifted, but the absence of movement was itself revealing. Let us not mistake, Holmes went on. This was not an act of passion or rage. It was deliberated, restrained. The very qualities that made her a capable mistress of this house, her poise, her discretion, became the instruments of its undoing. He turned once more to the inspector. It was not vengeance, it was strategy. Then to her, softly, and what is more cruel than knowing precisely what you are about to lose, and striking not in fury, but in arithmetic? Holmes now withdrew a second item from his coat, a right-hand glove, of the same silk-lined leather as the burned fragment. This, Mrs. Hartley, is the glove you claimed never to have worn. He held it up to the light, then turned it inward. Note the faint blotting upon the middle and ring fingers. It is not dirt, it is ink, precisely the kind used in your husband's study, and precisely the fingers one would employ when sealing a letter or pressing the pages of an envelope closed. Holmes's tone sharpened a fraction. When Mr. Hartley's sealed note was retrieved from Mr. Temple's drawer, it bore two faint impressions, oblong, like touch points. Your claim that you had not entered his study that evening is contradicted not by witness, but by oil and pigment. He placed the glove upon the arm of her chair. A single touch, made in haste, leaves its ghost. And when burned, the fire destroys the shape, but not the act. Celia did not look at the glove. Her eyes remained fixed upon the window pane, where the day had begun to dim, but her knuckles had turned white beneath their gloves, perhaps the only colour left to her. The silence that followed was not one of denial, but of something far heavier. Celia lowered her head, not dramatically, not with tears, but as one sets aside a glass already drained. Her cousin reached a hand toward her, only to falter midway, unsure whether comfort was deserved or merely habitual. Inspector Hargreaves stepped forward, the weight of duty plain upon his brow. Mrs. Hartley, I must ask you to accompany me. She rose without protest. Holmes watched her go with neither triumph nor pity, only a weary stillness that I had come to recognize after cases where the mind triumphed, but the soul recoiled. As the front door closed behind the departing figures, I turned to him. You knew almost from the beginning. No, Watson, you schwartz, he replied, soft and slow. I suspected, but the stairs spoke first. The glove confirmed it. He crossed to the fire, where the embers now glowed dull and red. There are no accidents in murder, he said at last. Only illusions, and illusions require hands. Hands that burn letters, shift rings, and turn out lights before descending stairs that do not lie. And in the drawing room, the shadows held their breath once more. There was no outcry, no fainting nor protest, no final plea for sympathy or denial. Celia Hartley stood, composed and silent, and allowed Inspector Hargrove to take her arm. Her mourning veil, already lowered, fluttered only faintly as they crossed the threshold, not in grief, but to obscure what might have shown upon her face. Whether it was shame, defiance, or the blank stillness of resignation, I could not tell, and perhaps no one ever would. Eloise remained seated, her hands trembling against the folds of her skirt, though she made no move to accompany her cousin. Mr. Temple turned his back to the room, studying the fire with a solicitor's detached sorrow, the kind acquired through decades of last wills and family disputes. Holmes, for his part, neither followed nor watched the arrest. He stood beside the escritoire, one hand lightly brushing the edge of the desk where Leonard's letters had once lain. The air in the room had shifted, not cleared. The removal of its most composed occupant had not brought ease, but an uncanny stillness, as though the very walls withheld breath in deference to something unspoken. And so, with slow steps, I followed Holmes from the room. We passed down the corridor, and without word or signal, Holmes paused at the threshold of Leonard Hartley's study. I entered first. The room was as we had left it. Papers squared, inkpots closed, not a book displaced. Yet a strange unease hovered, intangible and precise, like the faint odour of a blown-out candle. It was then that I noticed something I had missed before, though I could not say why. Above the writing desk, fixed to the wainscoting, was a small oval mirror. At first glance it seemed merely to reflect the dark wallpaper, but no. The mirror had been deliberately turned, its face turned toward the wall. There was no crack, no flaw in the glass. The action had not been done in haste, but with intent. A mirror turned inward does not capture the face, it silences it. "Holmes," I murmured, gesturing upward, but he merely glanced once and moved past it without remark. The meaning, if any, he seemed to leave to me. The absence of reflection I found was more troubling than any image could have been. Standing before that inward-facing mirror, I felt a peculiar discomfort not unlike that which overtakes one in a confessional, an awareness that truth, though unseen, lingers nevertheless. What had Leonard feared or refused in that blankness? Was it the visage of a woman he no longer trusted, or his own expression, altered by suspicion and cowardice? It is a curious cruelty, that a man may know himself guilty of nothing and yet suffer the pangs of moral compromise. Had Leonard sensed the theatre around him and chosen silence, or had he merely misread his own instincts until it was too late to correct them? I posed these questions softly, more to the air than to Holmes. "It is possible," I said, "that he turned it not to avoid her face, but his." Still Holmes made no reply. He had seated himself at the edge of the writing table and was toying absently with a paperweight, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. I felt then that my remark had either struck too close to something he preferred not to name, or had missed a deeper point entirely. We left the study soon after, though I could not bring myself to turn the mirror round again. The daylight was dimming by the time we emerged into Kensington Gardens. The frost had held fast to the soil, and beneath our boots, the gravel paths rang faintly with every step. We walked without haste, and for a long while, without speech. The trees, now stripped of all but the most stubborn leaves, stood like quiet sentinels to the season's retreat. Overhead, crows called once or twice, then lapsed again into their watchful silence. I attempted, half-heartedly, to draw Holmes from his reverie. I observed a passing gentleman whose exaggerated gait recalled one of our previous cases, the man with the tin whistle, but Holmes did not so much as glance in his direction. "You are unusually silent," I remarked at last. "I find," he replied without looking at me, "that the mind may be occupied with matters which resist verbalization." He did not elaborate, nor did I press him. There is a point, I have learned, at which even the most devoted companion must allow solitude its space. In Holmes, such moments were rare, but when they came, they were unassailable. We continued walking, our footfalls tracing patterns in the brittle frost, and the day bleeding quietly into evening. It was not until we had turned toward the park's quieter paths that I found myself speaking again, this time not to divert, but to understand. "There is something almost theatrical in it all," I said. "The glove worn on the wrong hand, the ring shifted after death, even the painted portrait. Was it not Leonard who once commissioned it? And yet the hands in that image are reversed, as if everything she touched required a mirror to be understood." Holmes gave no answer, but his brow furrowed slightly. "Symbols," I continued, more to myself now. "Reversals. not merely to mislead the eye, but to shape perception. She was not hiding her act. She was reshaping its meaning. I thought of Celia's expression as she had departed, veiled, silent, the picture of dignified bereavement. Was the grief genuine, or was it merely another mask, worn with the same precision as the glove turned to deceive? There is a cruelty, I murmured, in art that mimics sincerity too well. One can no longer tell the smile from the wound. Still, Holmes remained quiet, but his steps slowed just a little, as though the rhythm of thought had momentarily matched the cadence of my words. As we reached the perimeter of the gardens, the lamps began to glow behind fogged glass. A faint mist had begun to settle, draping the iron railings in lacework moisture. Holmes halted beside a low stone bench, placed under a row of barren elms. He stood there for some time, gazing not ahead but down, at the patterns left by our boots, the indistinct tracks of passers-by, and the fragile imprints that frost conceals and reveals in equal measure. Then, quite softly, he spoke. Even the smallest reversal, he said, leaves a shadow. I turned toward him, but he did not look at me, nor did he clarify. In Holmes's world, such remarks were not always riddles meant to be solved, but statements of observation, quiet truths left like coins on a grave. A moment later, he resumed his walk, leaving me to follow and to wonder. What reversal had he meant? The glove? The ring? The portrait? Or some more intimate inversion, within the heart, perhaps, that once made, casts its shape upon all that follows? He did not, and I did not ask. I have recorded these events not to bring scandal, nor to extend pity, but because they do not quite leave me. There are cases which resolve neatly, like the solving of a cipher, and then there are those, this among them, which linger as sensation rather than certainty. What returns to me, more than the stairs or the ink-stained glove, is the mirror turned to the wall, a man unable to face what looked back, or worse, afraid it might not reflect him at all, and the widow, Celia Hartley, whose mourning was as exquisite as a costume, and whose composure remained untouched, even in defeat. I cannot say whether she grieved for Leonard or merely for the life she had designed. Perhaps she herself no longer knew the difference. Some crimes are calculated, others are woven from silences and glances, from reflections too long avoided, and not all of them echo when they are done. As we stepped out into the cold grey dusk of Baker Street, Holmes lit a fresh match to his pipe, the flame briefly catching in his eyes. "It is curious, Watson," he murmured, "how often a deception hinges not upon what is added, but what is subtly reversed." A glove turned inward, a ring shifted across the fingers, not to hide the truth, but to invite the wrong conclusion. He exhaled slowly, his gaze lost in the smoke. In the end, murder is rarely born of rage, but of calculation, and calculation, my dear fellow, is prone to vanity. What do you think? Was the reversed glove the killer's cleverest move, or her fatal misstep? Tell me what you believe in the comments. I'd be fascinated to read your deductions. And if you enjoyed this mystery, do subscribe for more tales of shadow and logic, and share it with someone who loves a good enigma.